In October 2019, I was flying from London Heathrow to San Francisco to attend a conference on digital infrastructure for civil society. This was pre-pandemic, just. Everything was going smoothly. I was ready with a huge bottle of water, my headphones, snacks, everything you might need for a really, really long flight. At the boarding gate, they scanned my boarding pass, and it beeped. Not the usual beep, beep, but more of a kind of error beep, beep. I looked at my paper boarding pass again and noticed for the first time that it had 4 S's on it. I was asked to stand to the side with a growing group of overwhelmingly black, brown, and Arab people who were pulled aside as the rest of the group moved forward to board the plane, most of them staring suspiciously at us as they did so. We were led down a staircase that, honestly, I hadn't even noticed until that point, to a room with 4 tables each. 4 tables, each with a security personnel standing by it. I waited for the others to get searched. I exchanged wry looks with the other people, but also somehow tried not to. I was so somehow paranoid that I would seem suspicious, whatever that means, that I was seeing the suspicion in everything I did. If I caught someone's eye, would that be interpreted as us knowing each other or being in cahoots somehow? Eventually, I was up. In honestly what felt like an ideal setup for some kind of dark comedy skit, I was asked to explain the purpose of every single item in my suitcase. Mascara for my eyelashes. Trousers for my legs. After what felt like an age, I was brought back upstairs and allowed to board the plane. I texted my husband about it immediately. I looked up what SSSS stood for. Turns out, Secondary Security Screening Selection, issued by the Transportation Security Administration in the United States. There doesn't seem to be a clear flag for what triggers it. There's anecdotal evidence online, there's anecdotal evidence from friends I've met, friends I know who have Iranian or Lebanese passports who always find this label on their passports, and there wasn't a clear way to dispute it. By the time we landed, I was pretty outraged at what happened. I was also feeling a bit humiliated, a bit like my dignity had come into question, like I'd been assigned a label that indicated a kind of second-class status. My digital rights, or my data rights, had been violated. This label that had been assigned to me was clearly something that indicated my status, the way I got treated. And it was a label that not only did I have no possibility to question, but I also didn't know, and I don't know to this day, what it was about me that made that happen. I have my suspicions, of course. It was just after the Muslim ban got instituted. Trump was president in the US, and my surname is the 4th word in the Quran. I was entered into a database without me knowing, with real consequences on my life, and no way of fighting against it. And I saw things like this happening all the time. Technical systems that were built in a way that assigned people a certain category, sometimes with little or no explanation for why, and those labels having real impacts on what they could do in their lives. Let me give you an example. Indian media outlet The Wire has been recording all the hunger-related deaths directly linked to issues with the Aadhaar card. Aadhaar, in case you're not familiar with it, is the national digital identification system in India. It's also the world's largest biometric database with well over 1 billion entries right now. And there have been so many issues with it. Someone's fingerprints not being recognized properly and them not being able to get their food stamps that they need to be able to buy to get food to eat. Someone being falsely recorded in the system as being dead and their pension no longer being paid as a result. Those consequences are life-changing, sometimes life-ending. A lot of my work over the past decade has involved looking into how people's rights have been impacted by data and technology. I've researched how Rohingya refugees fleeing genocide in Myanmar had their biometric data collected by the United Nations Refugee Agency and the government of Bangladesh. They promised those refugees that they would keep that data safe. But then they handed it over to the government of Myanmar, the very government who had tried to commit genocide against them. I've helped international humanitarian agencies and development agencies think about how they could manage their data in more responsible ways. I've spent a lot of time thinking about worst cases and how to mitigate those. Last year, I wrote a book about this topic, how data about who we are is collected by others and then used to form often false impressions of who we are. With the book, I wanted to try and summarize everything I'd learned from all those experiences, trying to make harmful digital systems less bad. It's called Machine Readable Me, The Hidden Ways Tech Shapes Our Identities. And as I was writing the book, I realized that I had a whole lot of examples of how data, biometric data, databases, categories, labels, the way that digital systems are integrated into procedures have played a role in strengthening structural inequalities. It really made me wonder about my role in building those systems. More about that later. And towards the end of the book, after writing 5 chapters going over all the problems, giving so many examples, you know, in that nice end of the book where you want to just write the recommendations and the nice, tidy solution, I realized that by focusing solely on data, there was actually very little I could say that would meaningfully address the issues I talked about. The data-focused solutions, many of which I've worked on over the years, are things like carry out responsible data audits, where you think about the worst thing that might happen with the data and you mitigate it ahead of time. Or don't collect biometric data of vulnerable groups, because the risks just are too high. Or ensure that privacy rights and consent and agency are built in a meaningful way to the data collection as you go ahead. But if we're being honest, none of those solutions actually address the problem. If we think about the story I shared earlier, the real issue isn't that I was assigned a label that I didn't know how to reject or dispute. The real issue, if we really go deep into it, is that there are borders, and that certain people are allowed in and certain people aren't. And that migration policy that governs most of those borders is based on settler colonial domination. It's racist, it's xenophobic, and it completely ignores the deep historical connections between our countries. Yes, there shouldn't be random screening that profiles black and brown people, but also those screening procedures do exactly what they were intended to do based on the violent migration policy on which they're based. They profile black and brown people. Even if you were to get rid of that database of people with the SSSS label, or to make transparent the process through which they were selected, or even to have a really transparent and easy way of disputing it, that violent migration policy would still exist. And that's why, in the last chapter of my book, the only solution I could really come up with was solidarity. I realized that almost none of the issues I was writing about would ever be solved by looking at just the tech or data layer. The only way that those issues would be meaningfully addressed would be through looking deeper, understanding the deeper connections between those violations of rights as they appear within our technical systems and the long-standing structural violence and structural systems that enable them. And that the only way to fight against those is by showing solidarity with the people who have been mobilizing against those structural issues for decades, if not, and intentionally behaving in a way that helps support and fights against those bigger issues. It's really never just that data rights or digital rights are being violated. Think about it. All that most digital systems do, and I'm talking about those built or enforced by states and multilateral institutions, is reinforce or often even strengthen and add a sense of permanence to the status quo. So if something stands out to you as being a violation of digital rights, if there's a harm caused in a technical system, it's most likely that you're noticing a problematic, violent system, structure, or policy. The gangs matrix is one such system. It's a police database set up in the United Kingdom by the London Metropolitan Police back in 2012. It includes suspected gang members in London, but as Amnesty International wrote in this fantastic report in 2018, it's ended up being a racially discriminatory system that stigmatizes young black men for the music they listen to or their behavior on social media. A disproportionate percentage of the members of the database are black, and people who have never even been involved in violent crime are also registered in the matrix. This affects their lives, it affects the lives of people in their network and in their family. And often, they don't even know they're in the database. It's also, as the Amnesty report explained, a real non-solution to the problem it was purported to address. They said that they were setting it up in response to knife crime, a real problem in the City of London. But gang-flagged knife crime accounted for only 5% of all knife crime in 2016, suggesting that the very approach of attempting to focus on gangs as a way of addressing knife crime is deeply flawed. I'll give you an alternative approach to this. In Scotland, knife crime is far, far less than in the rest of Britain because knife crime has been treated as a public health issue rather than a policing issue. There are approaches that include prevention techniques, like engaging mental health practitioners, funding social workers, youth workers. These have all been proven to work. What has been proven not to work is over-policing, profiling. The gangs matrix was a shiny tech tool that completely ignored actual social approaches to deal with the social problem of knife crime. It was just a couple of months ago that it was announced that the gangs matrix would finally be scrapped. But experts have already flagged that what's planned to replace it, a violence harm assessment tool, will likely have the same biases and the same discriminations built into it. So yes, while the gangs matrix as a database was problematic, it wasn't the root of the problem. So when we start to see how digital rights violations are so closely intertwined with other oppressive structures, that's when we start to see how the necessary long-term solutions to these digital rights violations really need to be intertwined with other issues, be it gun crime or state violence, or addressing things as public health issues instead of going straight to the police. And in the data rights or digital rights space, I'd argue, we've not been very good at addressing or expressing true transformative solidarity. I'd love to hear otherwise from people in the audience, though. I've been in too many spaces where tech knowledge is put on a pedestal and lived experience of the ways in which tech or other structures impact lives is valued far less. But that approach is really doing all of us an injustice. It's only together with others that we can really see the power of our resistance. The structures of violence and oppression that make digital rights and data rights violations possible aren't new since computers came along. They've been in place for decades, for centuries. And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that just working on data rights or digital rights issues isn't useful. It really, really is, and it's really necessary. But I also think there's more that we, and I mean myself as well, could do to ensure that the issues that we work on are meaningfully connected to broader fights. So here are some suggestions on how I think we could get there, and I'd love to hear your suggestions later too. First, by using violations of rights as they appear in tech and data spaces as a signal towards broader structural issues, even as an opportunity to connect with those who are affected or those who are mobilizing on that issue. We need to stop focusing only on the harms as they appear in the digital space and instead look at the structures of violence that make those harms possible. I'm really inspired by coalitions like Abolish Frontex, a coalition of organizations, collectives, individuals whose demands include stopping deportation, ending detention, and also stopping digital surveillance of people on the move, as well as, of course, abolishing Frontex. All power to them. Second, by building connections between movements. I've been in a lot of spaces where we've talked about silo busting, how there's such a problem that people are having distinct conversations in different spaces and no one's going between them and these conversations aren't being connected. It took me way too long to realize this, but the way that those connections happen is through people's relationships. It's people's relationships that create that social tissue, that create this trust between spaces. And that trust is absolutely essential to ensure an intersectional approach to these problems. What that looks like in practice, I think, depends a lot on who you are and what you find interesting and what your skills are. But it could look like turning up to spaces that are really far outside of the digital rights space and just listening, building your own connections. Or if you're a funder, funding at intersections of digital rights and other movements. Like the Green Screen Coalition, a fund dedicated to addressing the critical nexus of digital rights and climate justice. They just announced a round of funding precisely at this intersection. And it's this kind of targeted funding that I think is so valuable to building social tissue between movements. Third, by showing up for issues that don't affect you personally. Whether that means going to Free Palestine demos, volunteering, becoming a board member at organizations that are outside of the digital bubble, taking the time to learn about issues that are new to you. I mention Palestine intentionally because it's top of my heart and mind right now. And also because there are so many reasons why, if you care about Germany, if you care about rights in Germany, you should care about what's happening there right now. German taxes, German weapons are being used to carry out unspeakable violence on an unarmed population. I'll mention just one incident. On Sunday night, 2 days after the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to stop its operation in Rafah, Israeli military hit a tent camp for displaced people, killing 45 displaced people. It was a tent camp where they had been encouraged to flee to. I really went back and forth on what image to show here, because the images coming out of that incident will haunt me forever. I encourage you, if you feel able, to look at those images to honor the memory of those children. If you care about tech and digital rights and surveillance, you should also know that there is so much repression of civil society and civil protest going on here in Germany too. I'll put it more clearly even. If any part of you cares about rights and justice, digital or not, what's going on in Palestine right now should break your heart and make your blood boil. It's never too late to... It's never too late to change your mind, to pull your head out of the sand, to start caring. Or attention and just say, what's going on there has gone too far. Whew. There are so many opportunities to show true solidarity, to stop looking away and to be part of making it stop. Zooming back out to the bigger picture, but relatedly, by ensuring that what you're working on is working to dismantle oppressive systems, not strengthen them. That what you're doing, whether it's solely focused on data and tech or not, is what's called a non-reformist reform and not a reformist reform. Let me explain these two terms briefly in case you're not familiar with them. I first came across them via abolitionist educator Mariam Kaba's book, We Do This Till We Free Us. And I find it a really useful way of articulating how connected our various issues are. Non-reformist reforms aim to undermine the prevailing political, economic, social order, construct an essentially different one, and build democratic power towards emancipatory horizons. This is a definition by Professor Amna Akbar. They're sometimes called abolitionist reforms or transformative reforms. They're things that work to break down these systems that are allowing violence, these violent systems. Reformist reforms, on the other hand, provide legitimacy or strengthen the existing status quo, essentially strengthening existing oppressive structures. In some cases, they might seem like a positive thing to do by doing a single policy or focusing on a single issue, but nothing is a single issue topic. If you look at them in terms of their broader contribution to the broader system, it's actually the opposite of what we want. I had a painful realization that I realized that many of my attempts earlier in my career to make digital systems less bad were essentially reformist reforms. I was taking part in working groups where there was a foregone conclusion to build a system, and my job was just to make it less bad. By taking part in those groups, by contributing to building those systems, even if I was trying to make them less bad, I was giving legitimacy to those harmful systems. Another example, I remember reading that the digital services team at the UK Home Office, which is the department responsible for immigration, had won a Tech for Good award for their work on inclusive design. That, to me, is a complete oxymoron. This is a reformist reform, because there is no good, there is no inclusive, when the overall approach of the entire department you work for is to do things like keep immigrants out or send immigrants to Rwanda. And finally, by being true to your values, the theme here today is who cares? What do we care about truly? What are we doing? What are the values that drive you, and how can you stay true to them in all areas of your life? Not just in digital society, not just in the digital realm, not just in the software you choose, in the way you think about who manages or should manage your data, but in all areas of your life, in how you behave, in the issues you stand up for, in the protests you ignore or the protests you go to, in the people you listen to or the people you ignore, in the strategies you choose, and in the way that you obey or dismantle violent power structures. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from my talk today, it's this. Working on digital issues without being in solidarity with other movements is at best ineffective, and at worst is violence. It's replicating the very same power dynamics that we say we're fighting against. Our struggles are connected, so our resistance must also be connected. There is no data justice without care, solidarity, and justice in our structures and our systems. Thank you. All right, I think we have a bit of time for Q&A, so I'm going to join you on the headphone. Ooh, that's funny. And I believe you have Katharina here who will be running around with a microphone. Thank you, Katharina. Do we have any questions? Have I stunned you all into silence?
Thank you. That was amazing. I have a quick one about your recommendations about standing with another group. So, for example, as a black man in the UK, if I stand with another group, some groups, then I also end up in another database because I'm seen as a threat, and so there's a risk. I'm not saying that it's a great idea, but there is a risk of you being pulled out of the group because you are another group. I just want some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I've had exactly the same thought. I've been taking my children to the Free Palestine demos, and often when there's not many other children there, we get lots of photos or people saying, "Can I take photos of you? Can I take photos of you?" And I don't want any photos of my children on social media, on that kind of thing. And it's different. It's different to what you were talking about, but perhaps the same in that you get lots more attention, even though that's not what you're there for. You're there to express solidarity. That's a really good point. And I think maybe the thing I forgot to say was standing in solidarity with groups that have less power than you is perhaps the best way to start. And I mean, I'm talking, like when I was writing this talk, I was thinking about what's the typical audience who come to Republica. It's kind of white, German, international, people working on tech issues, digital rights, who perhaps haven't had that much, who are very focused on the digital bubble. So my recommendations are very much at that kind of audience. But yes, I think your point is extremely valid. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Zara, thank you so much. Oh, it's weird.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. My question is about this solidarity that you mentioned. I've been in various movements. We've known each other for many years. We also talk a lot in these movements and in our actions of solidarity about feeling burnout from just the mere fact of keep fighting over and over again against powers that keep growing, and there's never enough technology, there's never enough money, there's never enough of anything. Yeah. So how do we keep coming together, and like how do we keep doing it? I know it's a very broad question, but just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really big one. I'm really inspired by Adrienne Marie Brown's work on pleasure activism, where we think not just about kind of fight as a struggle where we have to be putting our bodies and our hearts and our minds on the line every day, but as a thinking about how we can find pleasure and joy and valuing that just as much as we value all the other areas of what we're doing. I also think there's just so many people, there's new blood that we need to get involved in these movements. And I'd like to think, I hope and think that, there's the student movement right now. There's people who are new to these spaces, who have more energy, who have more privilege, who have not been struggling and fighting for years, who perhaps can pick up the mantle for us. Just one last question, I think.
Thank you so much. It was a really interesting presentation. It struck me what you said about knife crime in the UK and how it was handled by police in England and by health authorities in Scotland. How does that get assigned? Is that random? And once it's been assigned, at what level do you have to work to influence and to make sure that, for instance, health gets involved in England? Or is it too late at that stage? How do you tackle something like that?
I actually have no idea, I'll be honest. I believe that the decision to build the Geiger's matrix was a decision from the mayor's office. So it came, I don't know, from there rather than from kind of different health departments, that kind of thing. But yeah, I actually really don't know. I feel like there's actually a lot of really interesting ethnographic research looking into how technical systems are built. And it happens, sometimes it's really just kind of a top-down thing where someone says, we need a tech tool, and then everyone's scrambling to figure out how to build it. And it's often, if it's around an election cycle, then it looks really good. In this case, it was like, oh, look, we've built this tech tool to address this problem, and everyone gets distracted and no one looks at the actual data and the proven approaches, that kind of thing. But yeah, sorry not to be able to give a more thorough answer. I think that's it.
Okay. Then thanks again for that talk, and I would say give a warm applause to Zara.